Hey, look, it's Allo Colson again. Conson, rather. Excuse me, Allo. He says, somewhat related topic, he says the U.S. Army is allowing women to attend Ranger training. Given the limited number of available billets for Ranger training, the constant need for fresh deployable special ops troops, the far lower likelihood that females can pass the course, the expense involved in Ranger training, the expense involved in modifying facilities to accommodate females, and the laws against women in direct ground combat, is this a defensible position by the Army? What if the standards for female Ranger candidates are relaxed in any way? ? And then he included a link to something that basically said the pass rate for women in Ranger training is 19%. I would like to know what the pass rate for males is, frankly, but presumably it's much higher than 19%. All right, so this is a serious issue, and it's a little more nuanced than it might seem. I originally didn't think that women were going to make very good combat pilots, and I was wrong about that. Not even so much fighter pilots. They're relatively small numbers of fighter pilots, but there's some of them out there. But there are women out there right now flying helicopters, flying transport ships, and I don't mean to say that's all they do. I'm just saying there's large numbers of them doing that. There's women fighting bomber missions. There's A-10 pilots. There are women pilots in F-16s, and the ones that are actually flying combat seem to be the match of the men that are doing that, and so far so good. I was just wrong about that. That's all there is to it. When I say wrong, I mean wrong 10, 15 years ago. Now, when women are... there's a couple things you have to understand about humanity to deal with this question intelligently. One of the things you have to understand about humanity is that the kind of people that join the military, and Chris Cal's a great example of that in American Sniper, are what we would consider to be the conservative definition of real men. They protect women. And so when women are in combat with other warriors, I am concerned that the fact that they are female will put additional psychological stresses on their male warrior companions that would not be there if those were males. I'm concerned. I'm not saying I have the answers. I'm saying I'm concerned that men would take risks to rescue women that they might not take to rescue men, that they might make decisions based on this hardwired genetic desire to protect women. I haven't seen any evidence of this either way. So I guess so far, because this is a complex argument, you're going to get a complex question, you're going to get a complex answer. If we're talking about A-10s or something like that, let's say, an A-10 pilot who's a woman is doing the perfect equivalent of an A-10 pilot who's a male. She should have a right to serve her country just as a male should, and so far so good. When that pilot gets shot down, the thing starts to get a little bit dicier. But now we're talking about, let's talk about actual ground combat. I can understand and see a world where women combat troops are as lethal as men are in terms of their ability to put rounds on a target. I have become quite convinced that that is the case, that there's nothing limiting women from being able to be as effective soldiers as men are in terms of operating weapons and putting a world of hurt on our enemies. However, it is also undeniable, and I mean undeniable, that women cannot match men in strength, and not even close. We've had this conversation before. It was one of the big wake-up calls of my life to realize that if you take the fastest woman in the Olympics, in the history of the Olympics, the fastest time ever run by a woman in the Olympics, in the world ever, all-time fastest 100-meter dash for a woman, there's not a college track team in America that doesn't have several men that run faster. That most high schools have boys that can run faster than the fastest time of a woman ever, and in terms of lifting weights, there's a similar disparity between men and women. So, here's one thing I can state with confidence in terms of this argument. Here's one place that I don't think there's any place to retreat back from. If the physical fitness standard for Rangers is the ability to carry a 200-pound person, that'd be a soldier and his pack, let's say 250 pounds, carry them 100 yards out of combat, whatever the requirement is, and I don't know what the standard is, then there's going to be a very, very, very small number of women, probably 2 or 3 or maybe even 4 standard deviations from the norm, that have the physical strength to do that. If it turns out that they can meet those physical requirements without lowering the standards, then we go to the next step of the argument, which I'll deal with in a second. But if they can't, then that's the end of the argument. If you are basically saying to me that in the interests of social justice or political justice or the equality of women to serve their country or whatever other excuse you want to use, if you're telling me that a squad of 10 soldiers, 2 females, are incapable of carrying the other ones out while they are capable of carrying those out, then all of a sudden you are getting into very dangerous territory. I'm not willing to sacrifice the lives of soldiers to make a political or social point. I'm just not. I don't think most soldiers or families of soldiers would want that either. If it turns out that the standards for Ranger training are such that women can only get past them at 19% or whatever, that's the reality of the ground game. That's the way it is, folks. Men are generally much stronger than women, much stronger and much faster. And if you can find a woman who can meet the standards that are met for men, then you proceed to the next level of argument. And this is the second thing, and this is the one I am much less sure about. That one I'm 100% sure of. If you start lowering the standards for women soldiers, then you are basically endangering the men in the unit, and that should not be, it just shouldn't be allowed. It's lives are too important for this. Way too important. The second thing I would say is if the women can match the physical standards required of the men, then you get to a final level of argument, which is a pretty simple one, really. It's got nothing to do with women's hygiene or separate accommodations or any of that nonsense. I don't think much people care much about that in the field. Then the question you have to ask yourself is the presence of women warriors causing the men to behave in ways that they wouldn't behave if they were with male warriors? And my guess would be it's probably not. So I think if you want my final considered opinion on this, excuse me, and I'm not in, listen, here's one of these cases where I need to preface just how much I don't know about this. I'm not in a combat unit. I've never served in a combat unit. I'm just telling you my opinion, but the reality of the ground game may be completely different. My feeling would be that despite initial reservations, look, there were in fact the people trying to make the case for women saying, well, they said the same thing about black soldiers too, but that was a genuine prejudice. We're not talking about people who couldn't achieve the physical or mental requirements. They were certainly the match for the white soldiers in that regard. So we're not talking about a prejudice. We're talking about a physiological difference. So that's the first distinction. But there was a lot of resistance to black soldiers and black fighter pilots and black everything else. And it turned out that resistance was based on, well, that's the way it was, and so that's the way it will be. I think what you can get to is if the women can make the same physical standards as men, that kind of thing would probably go away. And I'd be willing to bet you it would go away. I'd be willing to bet you that if you had women who were able to match the standards of the men in every regard, including heroism and courage, then any prejudice towards them or special treatment would probably disappear pretty quickly. Now, with all of that said, I was recommended yesterday a book by my friend, desperate for friends, Andrew Clavin, who basically said, you really need to read this book, Homicide. Homicide is the book that The Wire was based on. It's about a reporter who spent, really more of a novelist, again, one of the best writers I've ever read. I just read 200-300 pages of the book last night. I just started reading, couldn't put it down. But basically, Homicide is the story about a guy who spent a year in the homicide department of the Baltimore Police Department. And in that book, he talks about female cops. He talks about the police's response to female cops. And it wasn't very positive. He basically said that the male cops, the male detectives, homicide detectives, and the male uniformed policemen referred to them as secretaries. That's a pretty disparaging term, but disparaging is where they were going. That's what they were looking for. Because he said that in many cases they simply could not fight. It's not through lack of courage. It's not through lack of desire. It's through the fact that a 5'2" woman and a 6'2" man, and the man's got 100 pounds on her, there's not a fight there. There's not a fight there. It's not a question of training. It's not a question of anything. It's not a fight there. That guy's going to destroy that woman. A 5'2" man and a 6'2" woman, I put my money on the 5'2" man because testosterone, folks, and muscle mass and and leverage and all that other stuff. So basically, what he said in homicide was that there were a very small number of female policemen that the male policemen made specific exemptions for, and basically would say, yeah, most until we know better, every female cop we see, we're going to consider it a secretary, except for Cheryl, Fishman or whatever. She's a cop. She's a real cop. She's tough. They had to prove themselves under combat. The guy was saying in the book that they came to places where there was a male and female policeman, and the male policeman was inside a bar getting the stuffing beaten out of him, and when the woman partner called for backup, and when the other police units arrived, she was standing outside pointing to the bar, saying the fight's going on in there, saying like she was a crossing guard. Look, I can sum this up now, having worked it through in my head. I'll tell you my personal opinion until I hear otherwise from people who have been there on the ground and can make a better case for this. But until I hear otherwise, I'll tell you how I feel about this. I think all women who enlist in the military or join the Army should have a chance to try out for Ranger training. I think that women have the ability to not only the ability, they have the legal right to live their lives and do the things they want to do just as much as men. And so my personal position would be that women should be allowed to try out for Ranger training, and that their selection should be no different than men, that the selection process for Ranger training should be absolutely race blind, colorblind, and sex blind. In other words, the form is the form, and if you are saying that the military is setting aside a certain number of positions for women, I got a problem with that, major problem with that. But if women are non-selectively being allowed to try out for the Rangers, and they go to the same school as men, on the same obstacle courses of men, and can match the same physical requirements as men, then I don't see any reason why they shouldn't be allowed to be Rangers. I don't believe, on balance, what I used to believe, which is that the men are going to behave much more differently. It doesn't seem to be playing itself out in the other areas of the service. You don't seem to find guys who are protecting women pilots or anything in that particular nature. I'm willing to be talked out of this by people who've been there, but unless you've been there in the field and you can make a better case than that, I think that is overriding. However, we all know what's really going to happen, right? We know that what's basically going to happen is they're going to try and basically say, well, women should have a right to fight for their country too, therefore the men's standards for Rangers will be this many push-ups and this much of a carry, and the women's standard will be this, and if we get into that place, then people are going to die. So there you go. So I hope that's clear. My moral and ethical position on this is pretty straightforward and consistent. Absolutely believe that women should have the right to do any job that a male does, but they do not have a right to do so with a different set of circumstances or standards if those standards will impact the safety of the men in the unit. In other words, if it turns out that they cannot match the physical standards required of men, then they scrub out, they fail. And if you look at bell curves and standard deviations and statistical distribution of any particular trait, intelligence, strength, speed, whatever, you will find that men are significantly stronger and faster than women. But with that said, the top couple of standard deviations of women will in fact be as capable as men in many areas. And if that far right tip of the bell curve is able to cross the line into the standard for men, then by all means let them be soldiers and Rangers. And that's my attitude on it. Let's see, we got a few more to go. Let's see if we can pick up the pace here. We're doing all right on time.